The elderly couple was abandoned by their own children, but they had no idea of the inheritance their parents had. The heat of February in Los Angeles made the atmosphere in the small house in the Hollywood Hills even more suffocating. Grace, 70, stirred the coffee in a dented aluminum pot as she felt the weight of Sandra's judgmental stares that morning. "Mom, are you wasting sugar again?" The sharp voice of her eldest daughter echoed through the simple kitchen. Sandra, immaculately dressed for another day as a supervisor at a telecommunications company, adjusted her faux leather purse on her shoulder. "Don't you have any sense of economy?" Grace lowered her graying eyes, her hands trembling imperceptibly. 50 years of taking care of that family, working as a cleaner to supplement the income, and now she was being treated like a dead weight. "Sorry, honey. Your father just likes his coffee a little sweeter," she murmured, her voice choked. Dad. Sandra rolled her eyes, painted with cheap mascara. "Mr. David needs to understand that we're not a bank, Mom. $500 a month just for heart medication at the CVS pharmacy. That's more than my health insurance." From the backyard came the heavy shuffle of Mark's boots, returning from his overnight shift at the refinery. The middle son, 42, had the exhaustion of someone who had operated heavy machinery for 12 hours straight on his face. But there was something more in his expression, a calculating coldness that Grace didn't recognize. "Hey, Mom!" Mark kissed the top of his mother's gray hair, a mechanical and empty gesture. "Strong coffee today?" "The way you all like it," Grace forced a smile. Mark sat heavily at the wooden table that David had built with his own hands decades ago. "Sandra, we need to talk about the situation here at home." The grave tone made Grace go cold. Sandra put down her cup with a dry clatter, her eyes narrowing. "What situation?" Grace dared to ask. At that moment, Robert appeared in the kitchen, still in shorts and flip-flops, his hair disheveled from another night of drinking at the local bar. At 32, the youngest son radiated a laziness that contrasted with the morning hustle of the house. "Good morning, happy family," he scoffed, opening the refrigerator without ceremony. "Where's the old man?" "Robert," Grace scolded. "Respect your father." "Respect?" Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Mom, you want to know the truth? I'm going to lose Jessica because of this whole mess." "What mess?" Grace felt her heart race. Sandra and Mark exchanged a significant look. Robert continued, relentless. "The girl doesn't want to come here anymore because of the smell of medicine. The old man's coughing. This whole situation." He gestured vaguely. "She said it looks like a terminally ill patient's house." "Robert!" Mark pretended to censure him, but there was agreement in his eyes. Grace felt something break inside her chest. It wasn't just words. It was the collapse of a lifetime of dedication. "Children," she began, but Sandra interrupted her. "Mom, we need to be practical. You're 70. Dad's 78 with serious heart problems. The house is small, it doesn't have the structure. And honestly," she made a calculated pause, "you need specialized care." "Specialized care?" Grace repeated, as if she didn't understand. Mark pulled a crumpled brochure from his shirt pocket. "The St. Vincent's Senior Living. It's close by, on Hollywood Boulevard. A specialized place with nurses, a doctor. A place for people like you," Robert completed, biting into a bagel. Grace's world began to spin. 50 years of marriage, 3 children raised with unconditional love, a whole life of dedication, to get to this moment. From the backyard, David's hoarse voice came calling for her. "Grace, come see the tomatoes. They're looking good." Grace looked at her children. Sandra checked the golden watch on her wrist. Mark studied his grease-stained nails. Robert chewed indifferently. And there, on that suffocating February morning in Los Angeles, Grace understood that she was completely alone. The night fell heavily over the Hollywood Hills, but Grace couldn't sleep. The old fan creaked on the ceiling, competing with David's difficult breathing beside her. The heart pills took effect, but her husband's sleep seemed restless, as if even in a dream he sensed the storm that was approaching. Grace got up quietly, putting on her worn slippers. She needed air. The house that had once been synonymous with home now suffocated her with memories that felt like nightmares. She walked through the dark kitchen to the back door. David's garden stretched out under the faint light of the street lamp. The tomato plants, her husband's pride, swayed gently in the night breeze. That's when she heard the voices. "We can't wait anymore." The voice was Mark's, in a conspiratorial tone. "The situation is unsustainable." Grace hid behind the half-open door, her heart pounding. I know, Sandra sighed. "But how are we going to explain it to the neighbors?" "Explain what?" Robert grumbled. Mrs. Wilson already asked if the old man was feeling unwell because of the ambulance that came last month. It's true, Mark pondered. And Jessica is right. The smell of medicine, Dad's coughing in the middle of the night. This isn't a life for anyone. Sandra lit a cigarette, the ember flickering in the darkness. I called St. Vincent's today. $200 per person per day. It's expensive, but it's an investment, Mark completed. Think about it. They'll have professional care and we'll have our lives back. And I'll be able to bring Jessica here without being embarrassed, Robert added. Grace covered her mouth to stifle a sob. It was her children talking about her and David, as if they were disposable objects. Their room can become my office, Robert continued. I can put my computer, my video games. Hold on. Sandra took control. First we convince them. It can't look like we're kicking them out. And how are we going to do that, Mark asked. Sandra took a long drag. Leave it to me. I'll talk about security, about medical care, about how they deserve a better place. You're cruel, sis, Robert laughed softly, but efficient. It's not cruelty, it's pragmatism, Sandra retorted. We can't be held hostage by two people who have already lived their lives. Grace felt her legs weaken. She leaned against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face silently. When? Mark asked. Next week, Sandra decided. I'll ask for the St. Vincent's van to come pick them up on a Monday. It's more discreet. What if they don't want to? Robert questioned. They'll have to. Sandra's voice became as hard as stone. The house is ours. They'll have to adapt. Grace swallowed her crying and went back to the room silently. David was sleeping, oblivious to the storm that was approaching. She lay down beside her husband of 5 decades, listening to his irregular breathing. Through the window she could see the 3 children still plotting in the backyard, near the tomato plants that David watered every morning with so much care. Dave, she whispered softly, what did we do wrong? But David continued to sleep, and Grace remained awake until dawn, knowing that her days in that house, the house they built brick by brick, were numbered. And the worst part, her own children were the architects of her ruin. Monday, 8:30 in the morning. Grace was finishing packing the small leather suitcase that David had given her for their wedding anniversary 15 years ago. Her hands trembled as she folded their few clothes, her husband's medicine, a yellowed photo from their wedding day. Mom, the van is already coming. Sandra's voice sounded fake, feigning a concern she didn't feel. David sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the blue button-down shirt he wore to St. James Church on Sundays. He looked smaller, more fragile, as if he had aged 10 years overnight. Grace, he murmured, are you sure this is what they really want? Grace couldn't answer. How could she explain that the children they raised with so much love now saw them as obstacles? Dad, it's for your own good. Mark appeared at the door, avoiding his parents' gaze. At St. Vincent's, there's a doctor, a nurse, other people your age, other people abandoned by their children, David murmured so quietly that only Grace heard him. The sound of the horn echoed from outside. A yellow van was parked in front of the simple house in Hollywood Hills. The driver, a middle-aged man with an unfriendly face, knocked on the door. Is this for the elderly couple? He asked without ceremony. Sandra opened the door with a forced smile. Yes, they're ready. Robert appeared carrying 2 small suitcases. Is that all? He asked the driver, as if he were organizing a simple move. It's enough for St. Vincent's, the man replied. They have everything they need there. Grace looked at the house one last time. The kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals, the living room where the children played when they were little, the backyard where David cultivated his tomatoes with so much care. The tomatoes, David murmured, looking out the window. Who's going to take care of the tomatoes? I'll take care of them, Dad, Robert lied. Don't you worry. David and Grace walked slowly to the van. The neighbors peeked through their windows. Mrs. Wilson waved timidly. Mr. Henderson from the bakery lowered his eyes. Visiting hours are on Sundays from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., the driver informed them, as he helped David into the van. Of course, Sandra waved. We'll visit often. Grace knew it was a lie. The van drove away down Vine Street, leaving 50 years of history behind. David held Grace's hand, both in silence, watching Hollywood Hills disappear through the rear window. St. Vincent's Senior Living turned out to be a place of abandonment disguised as care. The yellow walls were peeling. The smell was a mixture of cheap disinfectant and accumulated sadness. Grace and David were led to room 12, 2 iron bunk beds, a small wardrobe, a window that overlooked a lifeless courtyard. Welcome to St. Vincent's, said Nurse Valeria, a robust woman with a weary look. Breakfast is at 6:30 a.m., lunch at noon, Dinner at 6 p.m. Medicines are distributed after meals. Grace observed the other residents. There was Mrs. Antoinette, 83, who talked to herself, waiting for visitors who never came. Mr. Jonathan, 76, sat all day in a plastic chair, staring into space. And visitors? Grace asked. Sundays from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., Valeria repeated mechanically. But not everyone gets visitors. In the first week, David lost 5 pounds. He refused to eat the bland, tasteless food. He spent hours looking out the window as if he expected to see his tomato garden. Grace, he said one night, we can't stay here. But the boys said, the boys threw us away, David interrupted, for the first time in 50 years using a harsh tone with his wife. And if we stay here, we'll die little by little. On the 14th day, none of the children had shown up. Not even a call. They'll come on Sunday, Grace insisted, but her voice sounded less and less convincing. David got out of bed at 4 a.m. Grace, wake up. We're leaving. Leaving for where, Dave? Far away from here. To any place that isn't this prison. Grace looked around. Mrs. Antoinette was snoring softly. The corridor was silent. By her calculations, it would be at least 2 hours until the doorman woke up. Are you sure? She whispered. David held his wife's face with both hands. 50 years together, Grace. We're not going to end like this. Not this way. They gathered their few things in a plastic bag. David left his heart medicine. He only took the most essential ones. At 4:30 a.m., they walked silently down the corridor of St. Vincent's. David forced the back door open. The lock had been broken for months. And so, on a cold March morning in Los Angeles, Grace and David fled from their own children toward the unknown. But what they didn't know was that destiny was waiting for them in the form of a young mechanic on a dusty road. The March sun beat down mercilessly on the Interstate 5 freeway when David felt the first sharp pain in his chest. Grace and he had been walking for 4 hours on the side of the road, their feet sore, their mouths dry, carrying only a plastic bag with their belongings. Dave, let's stop for a bit, Grace suggested, noticing that her husband was out of breath. Just a little more, Grace, David murmured, but his voice came out in gasps. That's when the second pain came, stronger. David groaned and brought his hand to his chest, his face contorting in agony. Dave! Grace screamed, supporting her husband as he collapsed onto the dry grass on the side of the road. Cars sped by on the highway, kicking up dust and indifference. Grace waved desperately, but no one stopped. David was pale, his breathing becoming more and more difficult. Someone, please! Grace yelled to the unforgiving traffic. That's when she heard the sound of an engine slowing down. An old but well-maintained white Ford sedan pulled over to the side of the road. A young man of about 30, with disheveled brown hair and grease-stained hands, got out of the driver's side, wearing a shirt from Sam's Auto Repair. Is the gentleman unwell? John ran to them, kneeling beside David. Heart attack, Grace sobbed. He has heart problems, takes medicine. John didn't hesitate. With surprising strength, he lifted David into his arms. Come on, Mom, the hospital is close to here. John gently placed David in the back seat of the Ford, Grace holding her husband's head. The young man's hands trembled as he started the car. What are your names? He asked, speeding up on the highway. Grace, he's David, she replied between tears. John, he introduced himself quickly. I work at a shop nearby. Everything's going to be okay, Mrs. Grace. Everything's going to be okay. At the hospital, John didn't leave their side. While David was being attended to in the emergency room, the young mechanic stayed in the waiting room next to Grace, offering water, words of comfort, his silent but reassuring presence. Why are you doing this? Grace asked after 2 hours of waiting. John looked at his own calloused hands. My grandparents. They died when I was a kid. They were raised by my aunt. But I always imagined what it would have been like to have the chance to take care of them. And your family? Won't your wife find it strange that you're coming home late? Anna will understand. John smiled sadly. We've always wanted to have parents. The doctor came out of the emergency room with a grim look. Mr. David's family? She's his wife, John spoke up. The heart attack was controlled, but the gentleman is very weak. Malnutrition, dehydration. Where were you? Grace looked at John, not knowing what to say. How could she explain that they had run away from a senior living home because their own children had abandoned them? They were traveling, John lied without hesitation. The car broke down on the road. The doctor looked at him suspiciously but nodded. He'll be hospitalized for at least a week. You need to figure out where you're going to stay when he's discharged. Grace felt despair take over. Where could they go? Would they go back to St. Vincent's? To their children's house? Who didn't want them? Mrs. Grace, John said softly, Do you have anywhere to stay? Grace shook her head, the tears starting to flow again. John took a deep breath. Then you'll stay with us. What do you mean? Anna and I have a small house in the Hollywood Hills. It's not luxury, but it's a home. And you... He hesitated. You can be the family we've always wanted to have. Grace looked into the young man's brown eyes. There was a sincerity there that she hadn't seen in her own children's eyes for years. You don't even know me. But I want to, John smiled. We get to know each other by our actions, Mrs. Grace, and by our eyes. Your eyes are of someone who has always cared for others with love. That night, John called Anna from a payphone at the hospital. Honey, our family just arrived. And Grace, at 70, discovered that sometimes miracles come in the form of a big-hearted mechanic driving a white Ford on a dusty road. Anna arrived at the hospital still wearing her white nurse's aide uniform from St. Francis Hospital. Her brown hair was tied in a practical bun, but her eyes radiated a sweetness that Grace recognized immediately. It was the same look she saw in the mirror when she took care of her small children decades ago. Mrs. Grace? Anna extended her hand gently. I'm Anna, John's wife. He told me about you. My dear, I don't want to be a bother, Grace began, but Anna interrupted her with a smile. A bother? Mrs. Grace? I've dreamed my whole life of having parents. I'm an only child. I lost my mother when I was 15. John lost his grandparents very early. You've come like a gift. In the hospital room, David opened his eyes when he heard familiar voices. Hannah approached the bed with professional naturalness, but genuine affection. Hi, Mr. David. How are you feeling? Better, my dear, David murmured in a weak voice. But you don't have to. Yes, we do, John interrupted. We've decided. You're coming home with us when you're discharged. Anna held David's wrinkled hand. I'm on shift here at the hospital. I'll ask the doctor to let me follow your treatment. During the week of his hospitalization, John and Anna took turns visiting. They brought homemade food, flowers, and conversations that made David smile for the first time in weeks. Grace stayed at the couple's house in Hollywood Hills, a simple 3-room residence with modest but clean furniture and a small backyard. My goodness, Grace murmured when she saw the house. It's just like ours was when the boys were little. It was my in-laws' house, Anna explained. John inherited it when they died. We always thought the house was too big for just the two of us. The first night was strange for Grace. For weeks, she hadn't slept in a comfortable bed, in an environment that smelled like home instead of disinfectant. Anna had prepared their master bedroom for her, insisting on sleeping in the living room with John. Honey, you can't do that. Of course we can, Anna laughed. We're young, you need comfort. Besides, she paused, I've always wanted a mum to talk to before I go to sleep. And so the nightly conversations began. Grace would tell stories about raising her children. Anna would talk about her work at the hospital, about her dream of having a big family, about how John was a good man who deserved parents who loved him. Anna, Grace said during one of those conversations, why don't you have children? Anna was quiet for a moment. We tried for 5 years. It didn't happen. I guess God had other plans for us. He really did. Grace smiled in the dark. He sent us to you. When David was discharged, the transformation was immediate. John installed a comfortable chair in the backyard, exactly next to where he started a small garden. Mr. David, can you teach me how to plant tomatoes? John asked. I've never been good with plants. David's eyes shone. A tomato is like a child, son. It needs care, affection, patience. Anna watched from the kitchen window as Grace began to cook with pleasure again. The house filled with aromas she hadn't smelled in months. Seasoned beans, fluffy rice, roasted chicken with potatoes. Mom, Anna called Grace for the first time. Can I help? Grace stopped stirring the pot, her eyes welling up. Yes, you can, honey. Weeks turned into months. David regained weight and energy by helping John at the repair shop within his limitations, organizing tools, receiving customers, telling stories. Grace took care of the house with renewed zeal, cooking for the family that finally valued her. You know, Grace, David said one night, I don't remember the last time I felt useful. That's because here, we're a real family, Dave. On a December afternoon, Anna arrived from the hospital with a strange expression. John and David were in the backyard, taking care of the tomato plants that were already yielding red, juicy fruits. Guys, Anna called, I need to tell you something. Grace dried her hands on her apron. What is it, honey? Anna smiled, tears streaming down her face. I'm pregnant. The silence lasted for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then came the explosion of joy. John ran and lifted Anna into his arms. David clapped his hands like a boy. Grace hugged her daughter-in-law as if she were her own biological daughter. "You're going to be grandparents." Anna laughed and cried at the same time. And so, in the simple house in Hollywood Hills, 4 people that destiny had brought together discovered that family isn't just blood, it's love, care, and choice. But what none of them imagined was that a letter was on its way, bringing news that would change everything forever. It was a Thursday in May when the mailman, Brian, knocked on the door of the Hollywood Hills house. John was at the repair shop, Anna at the hospital, leaving only Grace and David at home. The elderly man opened the door, still holding the watering can he used for his tomato plants. "Mr. David Davis?" the mailman asked, checking a thick yellowed envelope. "That's me. Registered mail. I looked for you in the Hollywood Hills, but the neighbors said you didn't live there anymore." David frowned. It had been months since he had received any mail. He signed the receipt with trembling hands and took the envelope inside. "Grace, come here and see this." Grace dried her hands on the dish towel and approached. The envelope bore the letterhead of a law firm in New York. Drummond, Ferreira and Associates, Estates and Inheritance. "It must be a mistake," Grace murmured. David opened the envelope carefully. Inside, several sheets of letterhead paper, documents with seals and a typewritten letter. He began to read with difficulty, adjusting his glasses. "Dear Mr. David Davis, we are writing to inform you about the estate. Great-grandfather Sebastian Davis, deceased in 1987. Heirs located after a search." "What great-grandfather Sebastian?" Grace asked. David stopped reading, his face turning pale. "Sebastian. He was my paternal grandfather's brother. He left home when he was young and no one ever heard from him again." He continued reading, his voice becoming more and more agitated. "Net worth of the inventoried estate, $18 million, 12 commercial properties in downtown Los Angeles, awaiting the location of heirs for 3 decades. The paper fell from David's hands. Grace picked it up, reading for herself, her eyes widening at every line. "Dave, is this saying you inherited $18 million and 12 commercial properties downtown?" David confirmed, still in shock. Grace sat down heavily in a chair. "But how? Why only now?" David picked up another document from the envelope, a history of location attempts. "Look here, Grace, they've been sending mail to our house in Hollywood Hills since 2010. 15 years trying to find us. And we never received anything, because someone was intercepting the letters." The silence weighed between them. They didn't need to speak. They both knew who had access to the house's mail all those years. "The boys," Grace whispered. "They knew, Grace, they knew, and they hid it from us." The discovery was devastating. While David and Grace were in need, buying medicine on credit at the pharmacy, being treated like dead weight by their children, a fortune was waiting for them. "That's why they put us in St. Vincent's," David connected the pieces. "They wanted the house free to continue intercepting the letters," Grace cried, not only because of the discovery of the inheritance, but for the definitive confirmation of her children's betrayal. When John and Anna arrived that night, they found the couple sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "Did something happen?" Anna asked, concerned. David told them everything. John sat down slowly, processing the information. Anna put her hand on her 6-month pregnant belly. Little Victoria kicked as if she sensed her grandmother's agitation. $18 million, John murmured. "My God. And now?" Anna asked. David looked at Grace, then at the young couple who had welcomed them as family. "Now we're going to the lawyer to resolve this situation." "But Mr. David," John said cautiously, "that money changes everything. You can buy a big house, have all the comfort." "John," Grace interrupted, "do you think money will change who we are, or who you are to us?" "Are we leaving here?" Anna asked, her voice choked. David got up and went to the window where he could see the tomato plants flourishing in the backyard. "We're not leaving anywhere, but we're going to expand." "What do you mean?" John asked. "We're going to buy a bigger piece of land, build a big house with rooms for other seniors who are going through what we went through. The money that our children tried to steal from us will become hope for other people." Anna smiled through her tears. "A real home. A real home," Grace confirmed. But what they didn't know was that the news of the inheritance would leak out, and 3 familiar figures would soon show up at their door. The sound of a well-tuned engine caught John's attention, who was working in the backyard garden with David on a sunny June morning. Through the kitchen window, Grace saw a black Toyota Corolla stopping in front of the house, a recent, shiny model, completely out of place in the humble neighborhood. "Dave, we have visitors," Grace called, but there was apprehension in her voice. 3 people got out of the car. The first was Sandra, unrecognizable, her hair cut at an expensive salon, her nails done, wearing a silk blouse and dress pants. She wore imported sunglasses and a genuine leather handbag. Mark got out from the driver's side, wearing a white dress shirt, linen pants, and leather shoes, a striking contrast to the simple worker's clothes he used to wear. He had gained weight, his fuller face suggesting good food. Robert was the last to get out, and the transformation was even more shocking. The youngest son, eternally in shorts and flip-flops, now wore branded jeans, imported sneakers, and a polo shirt. He had shaved his scruffy beard and cut his hair. John discreetly slipped out the back, going to warn Anna at the hospital about the unexpected arrival. David and Grace looked at each other. They knew exactly what that visit meant. Sandra knocked on the door with fake delicacy. "Hi, Mum. I missed you." Grace opened the door, her face impassive. "Sandra, can I come in? I brought Mark and Robert so we could talk." "Talk about what?" Mark stepped forward, forcing a smile. "About you, Mum. We heard you're living here with strangers." "Strangers?" David's voice came from the living room. "The strangers took care of us when our children abandoned us in a nursing home." Robert walked in without ceremony, looking around with disdain. "Dad, this isn't a place for people your age. You deserve better." Sandra sat on the simple couch as if she were a queen visiting commoners. "Mum, we came to get you. We'll renovate the whole house, hire a private nurse, take care of everything properly." Grace sat down, facing her children, David at her side. The contrast was grotesque. Expensive clothes against simple furniture, imported perfumes against the homemade aroma of freshly brewed coffee. "And what's changed?" Grace asked, her voice firm. "What do you mean?" Sandra pretended not to understand. "What's changed between you throwing us into St. Vincent's and now coming here with this talk?" Mark blushed slightly. "Mom, it was a misunderstanding. We thought it would be better for Dad's treatment there." "It's a lie," David interrupted. "You knew about the inheritance." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. "What inheritance, Dad?" "From great-grandfather Sebastian," Grace said calmly. "The letters you intercepted for 15 years. Sandra tried to maintain her composure. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about." $18 million and 12 commercial properties, David enumerated. Letters that were arriving at our house in Hollywood Hills since 2010. The mask finally fell. Sandra sighed, taking on a more aggressive posture. "So what? Do you think you can handle that amount, with the responsibility of managing properties?" "We can," Grace retorted. "We know how to share it with those who helped us when we needed it." Robert got agitated. "Share with these parasites? Mom, you're being manipulated." That's when John walked in the front door, Anna at his side. The young mechanic wore his usual work clothes, Anna her nurse's aide uniform. The contrast with the well-dressed children was stark, but there was dignity in their simplicity. "Good afternoon," John greeted them politely. Sandra glared at him with poorly disguised contempt. "You must be the mechanic who's taking advantage of my parents." "Sandra," Grace scolded. "Taking advantage?" Anna asked, her voice controlled but firm. "We took your parents in when you abandoned them." Mark tried to intimidate them. "Look, you don't know who you're messing with. This family has assets, has responsibilities." "Responsibilities?" John laughed bitterly. "Like the responsibility of visiting your parents in the nursing home? Because in 2 weeks none of you showed up." Robert stood up abruptly. "Listen, you nobody—" "Robert?" David's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're going to respect the people who took care of us when you treated us like garbage." Sandra played her final card. "Dad, Mom, these people are manipulating you. They want your money." "No, they don't." Grace stood up, her voice trembling with contained anger. "Because if they did, they would have found out about the inheritance on the same day as you. But they only found out when your father and I told them." The revelation hit the 3 children like a punch. They had underestimated their parents' intelligence. "Now get out of my house," David ordered, pointing to the door. "Your house," Sandra countered. "You're living here for free." "It is our house," Anna said calmly, "because family is who chooses to stay, not who has an obligation." The 3 children left in silence, heading back to the black Corolla. Before getting into the car, Sandra turned around one last time. "You'll regret this." And so the 3 children who sold their parents for convenience discovered that true love is priceless, and that they had forever lost the only thing that truly mattered. 3 years passed like a soft melody in the Hollywood Hills house. What began as a simple 3-room residence had transformed into a true family complex. With part of the inheritance, David and Grace bought the neighboring plots of land and built a building that comfortably housed 8 bedrooms, a large living room, an industrial kitchen, and a backyard with a garden that was David's pride. The Home of Hope, as Anna had affectionately named it, became a benchmark in Los Angeles. In addition to Grace, David, John, and Anna, the house welcomed Mrs. Marlene, 84, abandoned by her children in New York, Mr. Oswald, 79, a former railroad worker with no family, Mrs. Hope, 81, whose grandchildren put her in a home against her will, and Mr. Walter, 77, who had lost his wife and was living alone. Victoria, now 2.5 years old, ran through the corridors calling everyone Grandpa and Grandma, spreading joy wherever she went. The girl had Anna's big eyes and John's generous smile, but she had inherited Grace's affectionate stubbornness. "Grandma Grace!" Victoria ran into the kitchen, where Grace was preparing lunch for the expanded family. "Grandpa David is teaching me to plant carrots." Grace smiled, watching David through the window in the backyard, surrounded by Mr. Oswald and Mr. Walter, all bent over the garden like children discovering a treasure. At 81, David had found a vitality he hadn't had in decades. "Mrs. Grace," Anna arrived from the hospital still in her uniform, "how was the meeting at City Hall?" "They approved our project," Grace replied, her eyes shining. "We'll be able to open 2 more homes in the city, one in Beverly Hills, another in Santa Monica." Anna hugged her mother-in-law of the heart. "You're incredible. You transformed pain into love for so many people." "We did, honey. You, John, your father and I. That's what family does. It transforms sadness into joy." That afternoon, David was particularly excited. He had finished installing an automatic irrigation system in the garden and wanted to show everyone how it worked. "Look at this beauty," he exclaimed to John, who was helping to adjust the sprinklers. "Now even when I'm not here, the plants will have water." "You're going to be here for a long time, Mr. David," John laughed. David stopped fiddling with the hose and looked seriously at the young man who had become his son of the heart. "John, I need to talk to you and Anna." That night, after the communal dinner at the large table that David had had specially made for the expanded family, he asked to speak with John and Anna in private. "Kids," he began, "Grace and I are getting very old. She's 73, I'm 81. We have to be realistic." "Mr. David, don't talk like that," Anna protested. "Honey, it's not pessimism, it's preparation, and I want to get everything organized." David pulled out a folder with documents. "I talked to Dr. Drummond, our lawyer. The will is ready." Grace nodded. "We decided together, children." David opened the first page. "Of the 18 million, 5 will be in a permanent fund to keep the homes running forever. Another 5 will go to you two, 3 to expand the project, 2 to raise our granddaughter." "Mr. David," John tried to protest. "Let me finish." David raised his hand. "The remaining 8 million and the 12 properties will create a foundation. It will be called the Grace and David Foundation, and the 2 of you will manage it. The goal is to identify and welcome abandoned seniors throughout Southern California." Anna was in tears. "You thought of everything." "And your children?" John asked cautiously. Grace and David looked at each other. "Each one will receive $1, Grace said simply. $1? With a letter explaining why, David completed, so they can understand that it's not the value that matters. It's knowing that even after everything, we haven't forgotten that they exist. David pulled out 3 envelopes that were already written. "The letters are ready. I explained to each one how we came to this decision, that it's not revenge, it's a consequence." "But what if they contest it?" Anna asked. "They can't," Grace smiled sadly. "Dr. Drummond guaranteed that everything is irrevocable. And there's more. If they try to challenge it in court, they lose even the right to the dollar." John held David's calloused hands. "Are you sure, sir?" "Absolutely. You are our true family. You chose to stay when you had no obligation. The others, well, they made their choice a long time ago." 2 years later, on a September morning scented by the flowers that David had planted in the garden, the patriarch of the chosen family simply did not wake up. Grace found him with a serene smile, his hands clasped over his chest as if he had fallen asleep peacefully. The wake was a celebration. Hundreds of people passed through the Home of Hope. Seniors who had been welcomed, City Hall officials, neighbors, health professionals who knew the family's work. Sandra, Mark, and Robert appeared on the last day, dressed in black, crying tears that seemed too sincere to be true. Grace received them with cold politeness. "Mom," Sandra approached, "we wanted to talk about Dad's will." "There's nothing to talk about," Grace replied. "Did you receive your letters?" "We did, but..." "Then you know our decision. Now, if you want to say goodbye to your father, he's right there. If you only came for money, You can leave. The three children approached the coffin. Robert cried, perhaps for the first time sincerely. Mark murmured an apology that no one else heard. Sandra just touched her father's hand, her lips trembling. When they left, they never came back. Grace lived until she was 95, long enough to see the Grace and David Foundation become the largest network of senior care homes in Southern California. When she passed, she was surrounded by John, Anna, Victoria, now a 20-year-old studying nursing, and dozens of seniors she had helped find a family. And so Grace and David proved that true inheritance is not measured in money. It is measured in love, dignity, and the certainty that we made a difference in someone's life. Dr. Drummond's office on Wilshire Boulevard, downtown Los Angeles, had that characteristic smell of old paper and polished wood. On an October afternoon, 3 months after David's passing, Sandra, Mark, and Robert were sitting in the worn leather armchairs, awaiting the official reading of the will. Sandra wore a discreet black dress, but her impeccably manicured nails and designer handbag showed that her financial situation had improved considerably since the last time she was in her parents' presence. Mark wore a dark, good-quality suit, a discreet gold chain around his neck. Robert, in turn, had definitively traded his shorts for dress pants and leather shoes. The physical transformation was evident. Doctor, Sandra grew impatient. Can we start? We have other commitments. Dr. Drummond, a 65-year-old man with thick-rimmed glasses, solemnly opened the folder containing the documents. Certainly. Let's proceed with the reading of Mr. David Davis's will. He meticulously read the provisions about the foundation, the amounts allocated to the Home of Hope, and the sums for John and Anna. The three siblings listened with increasing impatience, waiting to get to their parts. And as for the biological children, Dr. Drummond adjusted his glasses. Sandra Davis, Mark Davis, and Robert Davis, the testator disposes the following. To each of my children, I leave the amount of $1, accompanied by a personal explanatory letter. The silence that followed was disturbing. Sandra was the first to react. $1? Is this a joke? It's not a joke, Mrs. Davis. It is the express will of the deceased. Mark stood up abruptly. This can't be legal. We are forced heirs. You are, Dr. So, Drummond confirmed calmly. Which is why you each receive the symbolic amount of $1, thus respecting the minimum inheritance right provided by law. Robert slammed his fist on the table. We're going to challenge this in court. You can try, the lawyer smiled discreetly. But let me read an additional clause. Should any of my children judicially contest this will, they will lose even the right to the dollar stipulated herein, being totally disinherited. Sandra swallowed hard. And the letters? Dr. Drummond handed them 3 sealed envelopes, one for each of you. I believe you will find the explanations you seek. At home, Sandra was the first to open her letter. My daughter, Sandra, if you are reading this, it's because I have departed to be with the Creator. I leave you $1, not for revenge, but so that you may understand the true value of things. Do you remember when you were 12 and broke your arm? I spent 3 nights without sleep at the hospital, holding your hand. Your mother worked double shifts to pay for a private cast, because through the public system, it would have taken weeks. Do you remember when you graduated from high school? I sold my bicycle, my only means of transportation, to buy your graduation dress. Do you remember when you got married? I renovated the entire house so your party would be beautiful, but you don't remember any of this when you threw us into St. Vincent's as if we were old furniture. You intercepted our letters for 15 years. You knew we had a right to an inheritance, and you preferred to see us in need, buying medicine on credit. The dollar I leave you is worth more than the millions you lost, because it represents something you forgot. Dignity. I am not writing this with anger, I am writing with sadness. You could have been a wonderful daughter, but you chose to be a stranger. John and Anna gave us more love in 6 months than you did in decades. Use this dollar to buy some reflection. Your father, David. Sandra crumpled the letter, threw it in the trash, then took it out and reread it 3 times. She cried for the first time in years. Mark opened his letter on a sleepless night. My son, Mark, you were always the most balanced one, the one who made me most proud when you were little. Do you remember helping me build the house? Your brothers were playing, and you were holding the screwdriver like a man. That's why it hurts more to know that you were a co-author of the plan to abandon us. I thought your common sense would protect us from your siblings' cruelty. I was wrong. You work hard at the refinery. I know that. But hard work without a heart is worthless. John works at a simple auto shop, earns little, but he treated us like kings. The dollar I leave you won't even buy a soda, but it should buy you some shame. There is still time for you to be the man I raised. Look for your mother before it's too late. Your father, David." Mark put the letter in his wallet. He would carry it for the rest of his life. Robert opened his letter on a drunken Sunday. "Robert, my youngest son, the baby of the house who became a stranger. Do you remember when you were 5 and had pneumonia? Your mother and I took turns by your bed for 2 weeks. You almost died. We promised God that we would do anything for you to be happy. We kept our promise. We gave you love, a home, food, education. We never asked for anything in return. You repaid us with contempt. You said we would ruin your relationship. You know what ruins a relationship? A bad character. The dollar I leave you should be used to call your mother and ask for forgiveness, but I know you won't call. You will continue to be the same lazy, selfish and cruel Robert. Prove me wrong. Your father, David." Robert crumpled the letter, threw it on the floor and stepped on it. Then, on an impulse, he picked it back up and kept it. None of the three looked for Grace after the letters. Their pride was greater than their remorse. But late at night, alone with their consciences, David and Grace's 3 children discovered that there are inheritances that no money can buy, and that they had lost the most precious of all. 5 years after David's death, the Home of Hope had become a true institution. What started as a simple house in Hollywood Hills was now a complex of 3 interconnected buildings, housing 40 seniors in situations of family abandonment. Grace, at 78, walked slowly through the wide, well-lit corridors, leaning on a carved wooden cane, a gift from John on her last birthday. Despite her age, her eyes maintained their usual liveliness, especially when she observed the bustle of the large family she had created. "Grandma Grace!" Victoria, now 7, ran down the corridor and threw herself into her chosen great-grandmother's arms. The girl had grown up surrounded by dozens of adopted grandparents, becoming an especially affectionate and mature child. "Aunt Regina arrived with 3 new grandpas," Grace smiled. Regina was the City Hall social worker who had become a fundamental partner in the project, a 35-year-old young woman, efficient and sensitive, who identified cases of family abandonment and referred them to the Home of Hope. "Shall we go meet our new residents?" Grace extended her hand to Victoria. In the reception room, 3 seniors were waiting with their small bags. The first was Mr. Anthony, 84, a former baker whose children had moved to New York and forgotten to take him. The second was Mrs. Annabelle, 79, who lived alone in a substandard house until she was found malnourished by her neighbors. The third was Mr. George, 81, a retired railway worker who had lost his wife and had no more family. "Welcome to the family," Grace approached with the warm smile that had become her trademark. Anna, now 42 and the general coordinator of the project, appeared carrying a clipboard with the new residents' documents. Despite the years and the responsibility, she maintained the sweetness that had captivated David from their first encounter. "Mom," Anna still called Grace that, "I've prepared the rooms on the 2nd floor. Mr. Anthony will stay with Mr. Walter, Mrs. Annabelle with Mrs. Marlene, and Mr. George asked to be alone for now." "Perfect, honey. And John?" "He's at the new workshop teaching carpentry to the residents. Today is the day to make benches for the garden." John, at 37, had expanded his mechanical talent to become a true workshop teacher. In addition to fixing cars, he now taught carpentry, gardening and small household repairs to seniors who were physically able and interested in staying active. "Mr. Anthony," Grace addressed the former baker, "I heard you made the best sourdough bread in the city." The senior's eyes lit up for the first time in months. "I did, Mrs. Grace. I learned from my Italian father." "That's wonderful. Our bakery here at the home needs a master. Would you be willing to teach the recipe to the staff?" Mr. Anthony straightened up in his chair. It had been months since he had felt useful. "Of course. I can start tomorrow." Grace had realized a long time ago that the key to the seniors' well-being was not just offering comfort, but dignity. Every resident of the home had a function, no matter how small. Some took care of the garden, a continuation of David's dream. Others helped in the kitchen. Some told stories to the children at the community daycare that operated on the 1st floor. "Mrs. Annabelle," Grace turned to the frail lady, "do you have experience with sewing?" "I sewed my whole life," she replied timidly. "I used to make custom clothes." "Wonderful. We have a sewing room on the 3rd floor. The girls from the daycare always need little clothes, costumes for their plays." Mrs. Annabelle smiled, her first smile in years. "And you, Mr. George?" The former railway worker adjusted his thick glasses. I worked at the station for 40 years. I knew all the train schedules by heart. Perfect. You can organize our trips and outings. Every month we take the residents to get to know other cities, visit parks, go to the theatre. Mr. George sat up straight. He had found purpose again. That afternoon, Grace walked through the garden where David had planted the first tomato seedling years ago. Now the space stretched for 2 acres, with a community garden, an orchard, a flower garden, and even a small pond with koi fish. Missing him, Anna approached carrying a watering can. Every day, Grace admitted. But I know he's proud. Look at what the seed we planted turned into. The foundation approved 3 more homes, Anna shared the news. 1 in San Diego, another in Phoenix, another in Las Vegas. And who's going to coordinate them? We found people like us, families who understood that taking care of seniors is a privilege, not an obligation. Grace looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting over Los Angeles. You know, Anna, sometimes I think about my children. What do you think, if they know what they lost? I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about being part of something bigger than themselves. Do you have news of them? Grace shook her head. Regina told me that Sandra got divorced and is living alone in an expensive but empty apartment. Mark is still working at the refinery, but his colleagues say he's been drinking a lot. Robert is still Robert. Don't you feel like looking for them? Grace was pensive for a long moment. I do, but I've learned that love can't be forced. They know where to find me. Victoria appeared running through the garden, chasing a yellow butterfly. Behind her came Mr. Anthony, Mrs. Annabel, and Mr. George, all smiling like children. Look, Anna, Grace pointed to the scene. That's our true inheritance. And so on a golden afternoon in Los Angeles, Grace contemplated her empire, not of money or properties, but of smiles, dignity, and love, multiplied in dozens of hearts she had helped to heal. It was a rainy Friday in April, when Grace, at 83, decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time, go for a walk alone downtown Los Angeles. Anna had protested, worried about the light rain and the slippery pavement, but Grace had insisted, Honey, I'm 83, not 183. I need to feel the city where I was born. She walked slowly down Wilshire Boulevard, observing the changes that the years had brought. New buildings, different stores, but the essence of the city remained the same. She stopped in front of the CVS pharmacy, the same one where David used to buy his heart medicine when they still lived in Hollywood Hills. That's when she heard a familiar voice. Excuse me, are you Grace? Grace turned slowly. Before her stood a woman of about 50, thin, with graying hair and deep, dark circles under her eyes. It took a few seconds for her to recognize her. It was Sandra, her daughter. The years had not been kind to Sandra. The elegant and calculating woman had given way to someone visibly worn down by life. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, and there was a deep sadness in her eyes that Grace recognized immediately. It was the same sadness she saw in the mirror during the difficult times. Sandra, Grace said simply, without hostility or excessive warmth. Mom, Sandra's voice came out choked. How are you? I'm well, honey. And you? Sandra looked at her own feet. Not so much. An awkward silence settled between them. The light rain continued to fall, creating a melancholic atmosphere on the busy street. Mom, Sandra said finally, do you have a few minutes? There's a cafe nearby. Grace assessed her daughter for a moment. She saw there not the cruel woman who had abandoned her, but a person broken by life. All right. They sat at a corner table in the downtown cafe, a simple establishment that had been there since Grace's youth. Sandra ordered only a coffee, Grace a hot chocolate. Mom, Sandra began, her hands trembling slightly. I read Dad's letter many times. Grace nodded, waiting. And he was right. About everything. The first tears began to flow. I became a horrible person. Sandra. No, Mom. Let me talk, please. Sandra wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. After you left home, after the will, my life fell apart. Grace listened in silence as Sandra told her. The marriage had ended 2 years ago. The husband found out about his in-laws' abandonment and lost his respect for her. The 23-year-old son no longer spoke to his mother since he found out about the story. At work, colleagues who knew the situation avoided her. I'm living alone in a small apartment. I work at the same company, but no one respects me anymore. And the worst part, Sandra paused painfully. The worst part is that I deserve all of this. Grace held her daughter's hand over the table. The two had similar hands, long with prominent veins marked by time. And your brothers? Grace asked gently. Mark's drinking a lot. He lost his wife too. Robert, well, Robert is still the same. I don't think he even feels remorse." Sandra looked into her mother's eyes that still held the same kindness despite everything. "Mom, I came here today because I can't live with myself anymore. Every day I wake up thinking about what I did to you and Dad. Sandra, honey, I don't deserve forgiveness, Mom. I know, but I wanted you to know that I understood. I understood what I lost." Grace was quiet for a long moment, observing her broken daughter before her. It was the same face she used to kiss when Sandra was a child and had nightmares, the same person she had raised with so much love. "Sandra," she said finally, "do you want to see where I live now?" Sandra looked up, surprised. You would let me? You're my daughter. You always were. You always will be." The journey to the home of hope was made in silence. Sandra watched the city's transformations through the taxi window, but mostly she watched her mother, still dignified, despite her 83 years and everything she had been through. When they arrived at the complex that housed the home, Sandra was speechless. What was once a simple house had become a true institution, with well-kept gardens, children playing in the daycare courtyard, and seniors talking on the verandas. "Mom, what is this?" "It's what your father and I did with the inheritance you tried to hide. It's our real family." Anna appeared at the main door, worried about Grace's delay. When she saw Sandra, her eyes widened. "Mom, who is—" "Anna, this is Sandra, my daughter." The meeting was tense. Anna greeted Sandra politely but coldly. It was impossible to forget the cruel words that her sister-in-law had directed at them years ago. "Sandra," Grace said, "do you want to see the place?" For an hour, Grace showed Sandra every corner of the home of hope. The daughter met the seniors who had been welcomed, saw the workshop where John taught carpentry, visited the garden that continued David's dreams, and watched the daycare where Victoria, now 12 years old, helped take care of the younger children. "Mom," Sandra said when they finished the tour, "you saved all these people. They saved us too, honey. When you lose one family, you can find another. Or you can build a new one." Sandra began to cry again, this time without trying to hide it. Can I visit you sometimes?" Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she had given her daughter in years. "Yes, you can, but on one condition." "Anything, Mom?" "If you come to help, not to atone or feel better. Come to be useful." Sandra nodded vigorously. "Yes, Mom. Yes." And so, on a rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, the slow reconstruction of a relationship that seemed lost forever began. But Grace knew that true forgiveness is not a moment, it is a process, and that process was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the unexpected reunion at the CVS pharmacy. Sandra kept her promise. Every Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning, she would show up at the Home of Hope to help with whatever was needed. In the beginning, the reception was cold. Anna maintained professional politeness but was always on guard. John was cordial but distant. The seniors, sensitive to the emotional atmosphere, noticed the tension and initially avoided Sandra, but Sandra persisted. She arrived punctually, wearing simple clothes, willing to do any task. She cleaned bathrooms, helped in the kitchen, organized medicines, and read to seniors with vision problems. She never complained, never played the victim. Mrs. Sandra, Mr. Anthony, the former baker, called her one afternoon while she was organizing the pantry. "Can you help me with a recipe?" Sandra stopped arranging the products. "Of course, Mr. Anthony. How can I help? I want to make a special chocolate cake for Mrs. Marlene's birthday, but I need someone to write down the ingredients. My handwriting isn't so good." It was the first time one of the seniors had asked for her help directly. Sandra felt a strange emotion. It had been years since she felt useful to someone. "It would be a pleasure," she replied, grabbing a paper and a pen. As Mr. Anthony dictated the Italian recipe he had learned from his father decades ago, Sandra realized she was genuinely interested. She asked questions about the measurements, about the process, about the story behind the recipe. "Could you teach me how to make it?" she asked timidly. The elderly man's eyes lit up. "You really want to learn?" "Yes, I do. I was never a good cook, but I would like to learn." That's how Sandra started her cooking lessons with Mr. Anthony. Every Wednesday, after finishing her cleaning tasks, she would spend an hour in the kitchen learning traditional recipes. The former baker, who had lost interest in life after being abandoned by his children, regained the sparkle in his eyes upon finding an interested student. "Mrs. Sandra is different, Mrs." Annabelle commented to Grace one afternoon. "In the beginning, she seemed to just want to atone. Now it seems she really wants to be here." Grace watched her daughter from afar. Sandra had lost even more weight, but there was a lightness in her movements that hadn't existed before. She smiled genuinely when talking to the seniors and showed infinite patience with the repetitions and limitations of old age. "Grandma Grace," Victoria approached, now a smart and observant 12-year-old. "Aunt Sandra is cool. Yesterday she helped me with my math homework." "Really?" "Yeah. And she told me stories about when you were young, that you were very stubborn." Victoria laughed. Grace smiled. "I was. Aunt Sandra said you argued with her parents when you wanted to marry Grandpa David because he was poor." "I did. My parents wanted me to marry a rich farmer. I chose love. And Aunt Sandra said she understood that you always knew how to choose the right people to love." Grace felt her heart tighten. It was an indirect but clear message. That afternoon, Grace approached Sandra, who was in the garden watering the flowers. "Sandra, can I talk to you?" The daughter immediately dropped the hose. "Of course, Mom." They sat on the bench that John had built under the shade of the pear tree, a tree that David had planted in homage to the first happy months at the home. "How are you feeling here?" Grace asked. Sandra was pensive. "Different, Mom. In recent years I only lived for myself. Here I feel useful. And the seniors, they treat me better than I deserved." "Why do you think you don't deserve it?" "Because I abandoned my own mother," Sandra replied simply. "If I was capable of that, I'm capable of any cruelty." Grace held her daughter's hand. "Sandra, do you remember when you were 7 and you broke your grandmother's favorite vase?" Sandra nodded. "You cried so much that I thought you would never stop. You said your grandmother would never like you again." "I remember. And what did your grandmother do?" Sandra smiled sadly. "She hugged me and said that vases break, but grandchildren are irreplaceable." "Children too, Sandra. Children are also irreplaceable." The two were silent, watching Victoria play with some of the daycare children on the lawn. "Mum," Sandra said finally, "can I ask you something?" "You can. Do you really forgive me? Or are you just being polite?" Grace turned to face her daughter. "Sandra, forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a decision. I decided to forgive you the day you were born, when I promised to love you forever no matter what you did, even after everything, especially after everything, because forgiveness only has value when it's given to someone who doesn't deserve it." Sandra broke down in tears in her mother's arms, the first hug between them in almost a decade. "Mom, I want to be better. I want to deserve to be your daughter. You are already my daughter, Sandra. You always have been. What you need now is to learn to be a friend to yourself." "How?" "By doing what you're already doing, taking care of those who need it, being useful, finding a purpose greater than your own pain." That night, Sandra had dinner for the first time at the family table. Anna was still cautious. John was politely distant, but it was a start. And deep in her heart, Grace felt that David would be proud. His family was beginning to rebuild itself. December arrived in Los Angeles with the typical heat of the Californian summer, but the home of hope was bustling with Christmas preparations. Grace, now 84, supervised the decoration of the 10-foot tree that John had installed in the main hall, surrounded by 45 resident seniors, 20 children from the daycare, and a team of volunteers that grew every year. Sandra, who had been part of the home's routine for 8 months, had become responsible for organizing the Christmas dinner, an event that would feed more than 200 people, including residents, staff, volunteers, and family members. "Mom," Sandra approached Grace carrying a huge list of ingredients. "I got a donation of 20 turkeys from the supermarket, and Mr. Anthony taught the kitchen staff 3 homemade panettone recipes." Grace observed her daughter, noting how she had changed in recent months. Sandra had regained a healthy weight, her hair had regained its shine, and more importantly, there was purpose in her eyes. The cold, calculating telecommunications supervisor had given way to a woman who had found meaning in caring for others. "And the other guests?" Grace asked. Sandra hesitated. "Well, I sent invitations to Mark and Robert." It was the first time the names of her other children had been mentioned since the two of them had reconnected. Grace maintained a neutral expression. "And did they respond?" "Mark said he would try to come." "Robert?" Sandra sighed. Robert didn't even respond. Victoria, now 12 and practically a mini social worker, appeared carrying Christmas cards made by the daycare children. "Grandma Grace, look how pretty the cards turned out." Each child made one for each grandpa and grandma. Grace took one of the cards, colored paper decorated with glitter, and the message, "To Grandma Hope, thank you for teaching me to knit. I love you. Chloe, 8. "Mrs. Hope is going to be emotional," Grace smiled. "Aunt Sandra," Victoria addressed the new family member, "did you invite your son?" Sandra was speechless for a moment. Victoria didn't know the whole family story. To the girl, Sandra was simply Grandma Grace's daughter who had returned home. "My son, Victoria?" "Yeah. John told me you have a son my age. Is he not coming for Christmas?" Grace observed her daughter's discomfort. Sandra had briefly mentioned that her son didn't speak to her, but she had never gone into detail. "It's complicated, sweetie," Sandra replied delicately. "Everything gets resolved by talking," Victoria declared with the innocent wisdom of children. "Grandma Grace always says that." That afternoon, Grace found Sandra crying softly in the garden, sitting on the very bench where they had had their first conversation after the reconciliation. "What happened, honey?" "It's Ryan, Mom, my son." Sandra wiped her eyes. "He hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, ever since he found out about what we did to you and Dad." "Does he have a girlfriend, children?" "He has a girlfriend, Brenda. They're engaged, and Brenda, well, she hates me. She says she doesn't want a mother-in-law who abandons her own parents." Grace nodded, understanding. "And have you tried to talk to him?" "I tried, Mom, several times, but he says he can't respect a mother who didn't respect her own parents." "And is he wrong?" Sandra looked at her mother, surprised by the direct question. "No, Mom. He's right, completely right." "Then you need to prove to him that you've changed." "How? He won't even answer my calls." Grace was pensive for a moment. "Sandra, do you remember how your father and I knew you loved us when you were children?" "How?" "It wasn't by your words. It was by your actions, by the choices you made. And what's your suggestion?" "Invite him to come here, to see who you've become." "Mom, he won't come." "Then you go to him." Sandra was silent. "Honey, a mother's heart doesn't give up. If you give up on your son, you'll become just like what we were to you, parents who stopped fighting." On Christmas Eve, a surprise awaited Grace. Mark appeared at the door of the Home of Hope, alone, carrying a bag with simple presents. He was thin, his hair grey, but he was sober and had a look of remorse. "Hi, Mom." Grace hugged him without hesitation. "Hi, my son. It's so good that you came." Mark looked around, impressed by the size of the place. "Mom, this is incredible." Sandra appeared in the reception area and froze when she saw her brother. The two looked at each other for an awkward moment. "Mark," she said finally. "Sandra, do you want to talk?" Grace asked. "Or would you prefer I show Mark the home first?" "I'd like to see the place," Mark replied. For 2 hours, Grace and Sandra showed Mark every corner of the Home of Hope. He met the seniors, heard their stories, saw the workshops, the garden, the daycare. In every environment, he realized how much his mother and sister were loved and respected. "Mom," he said finally, "I'm an idiot." "Mark." "No, Mom, I am. Look at what you've built. Look at how many people are happy because of you." "And I," his voice choked, "I let all of this pass me by because of greed." That night, the Christmas dinner at the Home of Hope brought together an expanded family of over 200 people. Grace, sitting at the head of the main table, watched Sandra serving the seniors with genuine affection, Mark talking animatedly with Mr. Anthony about bread recipes, Victoria distributing the cards made by the children. Robert was missing. He hadn't replied to the invitation. So was Ryan, Sandra's son, whom she hadn't had the courage to look for. But Grace knew that family is built one heart at a time, and that Christmas, 2 hearts had come home. During the dinner, Anna stood up to make a toast. "I want to toast to Mrs. Grace, who taught us that family isn't who is born together, it's who chooses to stay together." Everyone applauded. Grace felt her eyes well up, but they were tears of gratitude. And at that moment, she felt David's presence beside her, whispering in her ear, "It all worked out, my Grace. Our family is growing again." 2 years after that unforgettable Christmas, the Home of Hope had become the largest social project for senior care in Southern California. Grace, at 86, walked slowly through the garden that stretched for 3 acres, leaning on the cane that John had carved especially for her, observing the bustle of her masterpiece. The Grace and David Foundation now operated 12 units throughout California and surrounding states: Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Denver, Houston, Dallas, Chicago, Seattle, Miami, and New York. More than 600 seniors had found dignity and family in these homes, and the project had served as a model for similar initiatives in other states. "Grandma Grace," a young voice echoed through the garden. It was Ryan, the 25-year-old grandson that Sandra had managed to reconcile with after months of persistence. Now married to Brenda, he carried Maria Clara, just 6 months old, a great-granddaughter of the heart, who was named after her great-grandmother. "How's my princess today?" Grace took the baby in her arms, her eyes lighting up as they always did when she was near children. "She's getting smarter every day, Grandma," Brenda smiled. The 23-year-old had become one of the biggest advocates for Grace's work after she saw Sandra's transformation up close. Sandra approached carrying a tray with cold lemonade. At 57, she had found her true calling. She coordinated 5 of the Foundation's 12 units, had graduated in gerontology through a distance learning course, and was nationally recognized as a specialist in senior care. "Mum, the reporter from NBC News arrived. Does she want to do the interview here in the garden?" Grace nodded. It was the 10th interview she had given that year. The Foundation's work had attracted national media attention, and she had become a symbol of resilience and hope for thousands of American seniors. Mark appeared from the other side of the garden, pushing a wheelchair where Mr. Walter, 89, was sitting. The middle son had moved to Los Angeles permanently 6 months ago, taking on the coordination of the carpentry and workshops for all the homes. He had completely stopped drinking and found a way to channel his creativity through carpentry. "Mom, I finished the dresser for the new room. Do you want to take a look?" "Of course, son." After the interview, Anna approached with John and Victoria, now 14 and an official volunteer at the home. The girl had grown up surrounded by dozens of adopted grandparents and had developed an impressive emotional maturity, already deciding that she would study gerontology just like Sandra. Mrs. Grace, John at 42 and the Foundation's executive director, the mayor called. They want to create a recognition plaque in the city's main square, the Grace and David Hope Plaza. Grace was emotional. "It's not necessary, John." "Yes, it is, Mom," Anna interrupted. "You changed the lives of thousands of people. It's the least they can do." The interview was moving. Sitting in the garden where David had planted the first tomato plants, surrounded by 4 generations of her expanded family, Grace told her story with serenity and wisdom. "Mrs. Grace?" the reporter asked. "What is the greatest lesson you learned on this journey?" Grace looked around, Sandra organizing a bingo game for the seniors, Mark teaching carpentry to at-risk youth, Ryan pushing Mr. Anthony in his wheelchair, Brenda nursing Maria Clara, Victoria reading stories to the daycare children, Anna supervising the medicinal garden, John fixing Mrs. Hope's rocking chair. "I learned that family is not a biological accident, it's a daily choice," she replied. "And I learned that when you care for someone with true love, that love multiplies in ways you never imagined." "And what about your children who initially abandoned you?" Grace smiled serenely. 2 of them understood their mistakes and decided to change. "That's more than many families achieve. As for the 3rd one," she paused, "the doors of our house are still open. True love has no expiration date. Robert never came back." According to information that arrived sporadically, he continued to live the same life as before, living alone, working sporadically, without showing any remorse or interest in reconciliation. "Aunt Sandra," Victoria asked later, "don't you get sad that Uncle Robert never came?" Sandra, who was preparing smoothies for the diabetic seniors, stopped to reflect. "I do, Victoria, but I've learned that you can't force anyone to change. You can only set an example and hope that one day the person will wake up." Epilogue. 5 years later, Grace passed away at 91 on a September morning, sleeping peacefully in the same bed where David had passed. Her last wish was to see the garden through the window. The tomato plants were still flourishing vigorously. The wake lasted for 3 days. More than 5,000 people passed through the Home of Hope to say their goodbyes. The governor, mayors of 12 cities, hundreds of seniors who had been welcomed by the homes, and entire families who had been inspired by Grace's example attended. Sandra, Mark, and Robert were present. Robert appeared on the last day, alone, wearing simple clothes. He didn't speak to anyone, just stood for a few minutes in front of his mother's coffin. As he left a letter. "Mum, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I haven't changed. I haven't become a better person like Sandra and Mark, but I wanted you to know that I always admired your strength. The world is better because you existed. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." The Grace and David Foundation continued to grow. Sandra became the president, Mark the operational coordinator. Anna and John remained at the original home, which became a historical landmark in Los Angeles. Victoria, at 19, graduated in gerontology and created the first effective caregivers course in the United States, teaching that caring for seniors is a privilege, not an obligation. Ryan and Brenda had 2 more children, David, in honor of his great-grandfather, and Hope, a name Grace chose before she passed. The 3 children grew up hearing stories of the great-grandmother who transformed abandonment into love. Robert died alone 5 years later, at 49. He left his few belongings to a neighbor who didn't even know his last name. In his wallet, they found the crumpled letter that David had written years ago, along with a faded photo of the family, Grace, David, and the 3 small children on a Sunday in the main city plaza. Sandra and Mark organized a simple funeral. Few people attended, some bar friends, curious neighbors, and the expanded family from the Home of Hope. Sandra cried for the first time in years, thinking about the brother who could never forgive himself. He carried that photo his whole life, Mark murmured, holding the yellowed photograph. Deep down, he knew what he had lost. 10 years after Grace's death, the Grace and David Foundation had expanded internationally. Units operated in Canada, England, Mexico, Italy, and France. The American model of effective senior care was studied in universities across Europe and Asia. Mrs. Sandra, a journalist asked during an interview on CNN, you could have inherited millions of dollars. Instead, you chose to dedicate your life to seniors. Do you have any regrets? Sandra smiled, her hair now completely grey, but her eyes shining with renewed purpose. I inherited something much more valuable than money, she replied. I inherited the chance to honor my mother and father. I inherited the privilege of caring for those who need it most. I inherited a family of thousands of people who call me daughter, sister, friend. The camera focused on the garden of the original Home of Hope, where more than 100 seniors lived with dignity. In the center, a bronze statue of Grace and David, he holding a tomato plant, she with her arms open in a gesture of welcome. And your greatest achievement? The reporter continued. Sandra pointed to Victoria, now a 24-year-old who was playing with the daycare children, while explaining the home's operations to a group of university students. My greatest achievement is knowing that when I'm gone, this story will continue, that my mother's love will multiply through the next generations. 15 years after Grace's death, Mark, at 67, inaugurated the 200th Foundation Unit, this time in Miami, Florida. The project had gone national, serving at-risk seniors from coast to coast. Mr. Mark, the mayor of Miami asked during the ceremony, how would your parents feel seeing all this? Mark looked at the Miami horizon, where the sun was setting in shades of orange over the dark waters of the ocean. My father David always said that family is like a plant. You care for it with affection, and it grows beyond what you imagined. He paused, emotional. I think they would be proud to see how many families were born from the seed they planted. That night, Mark called Sandra from his hotel in Miami. Sis, do you remember the last conversation we had with Mom? Which one? Sandra asked from Los Angeles, where she still lived in the original Hollywood Hills house, which had been turned into a memorial. She said she wanted our story to inspire other families to never give up on each other. I remember. Why? Because today I received a letter from a family in Seattle. The children read our story online and decided to take their parents out of the nursing home to care for them at home. They sent a picture. They're all together, happy. Sandra smiled on the other end of the line. Mom did it, Mark. She turned our shame into hope for other people. 20 years after Grace's death, Anna, now 60 and the Foundation's national director, was speaking at the U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C. The Grace and David Act was being voted on, legislation that would guarantee fundamental rights for abandoned seniors and create a national network of senior care homes. Honorable Senators, Anna spoke with the serenity she had learned from Grace, we are not here to punish families who abandon seniors. We are here to create structures that prevent this abandonment from happening. The project was approved unanimously. The United States became a global pioneer in legislation for senior protection. Victoria, now a gerontology doctor and a professor at UCLA, watched from the gallery. At 30, she had married a geriatrician, and they had 2 children, Grace Hope and David Mark, names that honored their great-grandparents of the heart. Aunt Anna, Victoria approached after the session, do you think Grandma Grace ever imagined it would come to this? Anna smiled, remembering the afternoon she had found Grace and David collapsed on the side of the highway 25 years ago. Your grandmother always said that small acts of love can change the world. I think she knew she was planting a very special seed. 25 years after Grace's death, Sandra passed away at 82, in the same room where Grace had passed decades before. Her last words were, Mum, we did it. We managed to transform our story. The wake lasted for a week. Representatives from all 23 countries where the Foundation's units operated were present. The U.S. President declared an official 3-day period of mourning. Mark, now 87, spoke emotionally. My sister Sandra made terrible mistakes in the past, but she proved that it's never too late to change, to atone, to become the person our parents dreamed we would be. Victoria, speaking on behalf of the new generations, concluded, Aunt Sandra taught us that redemption is not about forgetting mistakes. It's about turning them into bridges to a better future. She will be remembered not for what she did wrong, but for what she did right in the last 40 years of her life. 30 years after Grace's death, the world had changed, but the original Hollywood Hills house remained intact, preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. John, at 82, still received visitors daily, telling the story of how it all began with a couple abandoned on a dusty road. Mr. John, a young Japanese journalist who came to the US specifically to learn the story, asked, "What was the exact moment you knew that Grace and David were special?" John, his hair completely white but his eyes still bright, pointed to the garden in the back of the house, where tomato plants continued to be grown by volunteers. "It was when I saw Mr. David, even sick, even abandoned by his children, planting tomatoes for other people to eat. In that moment, I understood that I was in the presence of a man who knew that life only has meaning when we serve one another." Mark, Grace, and David's last living child, passed away that same year, at 92. In his will, he left a letter to be read publicly. "I spent the last 45 years of my life trying to make up for the 5 minutes of cruelty I committed against my parents. I learned that redemption is not about balancing the scales. It's about dedicating every remaining day to honoring those we have hurt. May the next generations never forget, family is the most precious thing there is, and when you lose it due to pride or greed, you may never find peace again." Final epilogue, 50 years later. Half a century after Grace fled from St. Vincent's on a desperate night, Los Angeles inaugurated the Grace and David International Complex, a 200-acre campus that housed a gerontology university, a geriatric hospital, a research center on aging, and 20 model senior homes. More than 15 million seniors worldwide had benefited from the philosophy created by a simple woman from Southern California who refused to accept that being old meant being disposable. Grace Hope, Victoria's great-granddaughter and Grace's great-great-granddaughter of the heart, now 25 and a gerontology doctor, spoke at the opening ceremony of the complex. Grace passed away thinking she had failed as a mother because 3 of her children abandoned her. She didn't know that, through the kindness of 2 strangers who welcomed her, she would become a mother to millions. Today, 50 years later, children all over the world grow up hearing the story of Grandma Grace, the woman who transformed the greatest abandonment into the greatest care in modern history. Her life teaches us that it doesn't matter how many times you fall, how many times you are rejected, how many times your own children turn their backs on you. There will always be someone willing to lend you a hand. And when that happens, grab that hand, because from it can be born a family bigger and more beautiful than the one you lost. At the end of the ceremony, 50,000 people released biodegradable balloons into the Los Angeles sky. On each balloon, a phrase that Grace used to repeat, "Family is not who is born together, it's who chooses to stay together." And so, on a golden September afternoon, the story of a woman who was abandoned by her children and found family in the hearts of strangers continued to inspire millions of people around the world, proving that true love has no borders, no age limit, and never has an expiration date. Grace's most precious inheritance was not the $18 million she left to John and Anna. It was the certainty that, even when everything seems lost, it is always possible to start over. And that family is what we build with the hands of the heart, not with the ties of blood. Hand somewhere, in a dimension where there is no time or pain, Grace and David smile knowing that the seed of love they planted in a simple Hollywood Hills house turned into a forest of hope that covered the entire world. The end final word. This story is dedicated to all seniors who have been abandoned by family members and found love in the hearts of strangers. It is also dedicated to those who, like Sandra and Mark, discovered that it is never too late to change, to ask for forgiveness, to become better people. And most of all, it is dedicated to the Johns and Annas of life, people who open their homes and hearts to welcome those who need it most, proving that humanity still has hope. Because in the end, we are all adopted children of love. And true love doesn't know DNA. It only knows dedication, care, and the daily decision to stand by those we choose to love. The story of Grace and David continues in every act of kindness, in every extended hand, in every family that chooses love over abandonment. And so it will be, forever.